Now we're going to talk about seasonal relatives and decisionalizing data. I'm sure you've heard of seasonally adjusted forecasts, seasonally adjusted employment figures, or something like that. Close to what we're going to do. So we assume that the data that we're looking at has some seasonal variation in it. It varies according to the month that it is. So October has certain characteristics common to it, and uh, November has certain characteristics common to it. So what we want to do when we use seasonal relatives is to separate out the seasonality in the data from the trend in the data. So let's do some drawing, and forgive me when I do this because I'm not the best person. So here we've got a graph of data, a chart of data, sales against time. We're going to do unit sales against time. So we have sales on this side, and we've got time on the x-axis. Now, the data might look something like this. It has trends with occasional spikes to account for seasonality. And I understand that in everything I've been doing, I've been treating seasonality as if it's always a peak in the data. It can be a trough as well. It doesn't have to be a peak. It can also be low sales. But let's treat it the way we've been treating it. Now you can see that this data has seasonal variation, uh, as evidenced by the peaks, but it also has a trend because it's moving upwards. So when you use seasonal data for forecasting, one way to handle seasonality is to use the same period from the time before to predict this period. So October predicts October, November predicts November, etc. The other way to do it is to run a regression and use a dummy variable as an additional X factor to account for the seasonality. A third option is to use seasonal relatives, and some systems will give you the numbers to use. They'll give you the seasonal variables for every single month or every single season, and then you can use that in your forecast data. We are going to calculate the seasonal variables ourselves, but let's start simple and talk about what you do once you have the seasonal variables. So here is the unit sales for all months, and what we want to do is remove the seasonal factor. We do that using a process called decisionalization. We take the data and divide it by the seasonal factor, or seasonal relatives, or seasonal variable, something like that. We divide it. When we do the division, we say the data has been deseasonalized. So we've removed the seasonal factor from the data, the seasonality in the data. All we're left is whatever trend is underlying that data. Once we get that data, we use it to build our forecast. And when we're done with the forecasting, we add seasonality back. So we deseasonalize the data, do the forecast, and then add back seasonality. We're going to take this one step at a time, right? First, we need the seasonal variables to be able to calculate the seasonal factor. Again, if you are given these seasonal variables, you are done. You don't need to worry. We've got months of data, so I'm going to call this month. It's not weekday, so month. I'm going to copy this in Excel. Now this is just overkill, by the way. It's a me thing. Paste. Uh, because I used formulas to calculate the months in Excel, it's kind of pasting it incorrectly. So what I'm going to do is just paste the values in the cell. Is that working? Escape. Let's try this again. Copy. I'm going to go to column K, right click, paste values only. Then I'm going to go to data, and I'm going to delete duplicates. One of these allows you to delete the duplicates in your data, and conveniently it is this wizard right here. I'm going to say select months. My data has header, delete duplicates, okay, and I'm left with the months. Now I'm just going to sort that data. So data, we're going to go to the home page. I'm going to do find and sort. I'm going to do a custom sort. I'm going to sort from the smallest to the largest. That's better. This is just for display. It doesn't really mean anything, but it just makes sense for me to have it 1 to 12. So now I'm going to calculate the factor. I'm going to call it seasonal relative. And the factor is the sum of the average for the month or the season you're looking at divided by the average of all averages, or just the average of the data. Okay, so this is one method. It's not the best method, but it is the easiest method for calculating seasonal relatives. So I'm going to do is equal to the average. I'm going to use Excel's beautiful averaging functionality, average if function. So average if, that's the formula I'm using, average if. It needs the range you want to average. It needs the range for the criteria. It needs the criteria, and then it needs the average range. So let's see if I'm doing this correctly. So I'm going to say look in this range for these values here, and if you find it, average this range. Let's see if that makes sense. Okay, so that gives me the average of all the January months, and I'm going to test it. I'm going to say average, do a manual average just to make sure I'm on point. The first value, the second January value, let's say the third January value, the fourth value, and the fifth value, and it should match what I have here. It does, so my formula is on point. I've selected it correctly. Once I have the average of January, I'm going to divide by the total average. Actually, you know what? Let's do it properly. So I've got average of January. Now let's copy the formula. I'm going to make the location for monthly data and for unit data permanent. So click over it and click F4. Change it from a relative address to a permanent address. So I want it to look within the cell all the time, regardless of where I copy the data, and in this group of cells for the values to average. And then I'm going to make the criteria in K2, I'm going to make that relative. So when I copy the address downwards, it would just copy everything with it. So this is the first half. I'm just averaging for each single month. Now, if I click on December data, you'll see that it kept the address as absolute. I'm just checking to make sure everything looks good, and it does look good. I've got the average for each individual month. Now I'm going to do the average of all the averages. Okay, that's the average of all the averages. I just call that grand average. Let's format it like that so you can see, right? So that's the average of the averages. Now to get my seasonal factor, I have to do the average for the season, and I'm using the months to represent the seasons, divided by the total average. There is circular reference in my data. And of course, I can go into Excel and tell it to ignore circular reference. Circular reference occurs when you're using data to calculate a data that is then used in the data piece, in the calculation piece again. So you can see how this happened, right? This value is part of this average, and then I'm dividing that value by the average. It doesn't quite, it could work. You could set up iteration in Excel by going to File, Options, and I think it's under General. There is an option for circular, allow iterative processing, and you could mark that. But instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the circular reference. I'm just going to use the average of all of the data, because it should be the same thing. So I'm selecting all of the data, and I'm going to find the average, and that gives me the seasonal relative of 1. This row is no longer relevant. And I'm going to do the same thing, right? Now that I've done this, I'm going to make the addresses permanent and copy the seasonal formula all the way down to December. So what this seasonal relative tells me is that without seasonality in the data, December's data is 99% of the average, and November's data is 97% of the average, and December's data is 107% of the average. That's what it's telling me. If we didn't consider seasonal, if there was no seasonality in our data and there was just trend, the values that we observe will be a little bit different. So we are going to readjust the data to figure out what the values should be. So we'll say deseasonalized data, and that would be the original data divided by the seasonal factor. So if there was no seasonality in the data, October's data, I'm actually using the wrong period. I apologize. This is the seasonal factor for January. This is the seasonal factor for February, March, and this is the one for October. So if there was no seasonality in the data, October's data would have been 664 units. But because of seasonality, we actually sold 107% of what is normal, what is average, what we should have sold, if that makes sense. So that's what we have here. Now, I need to formulate an Excel formula because I can't keep looking for the seasonal averages when I want to do this. So I'm going to say, I might use an if statement or a lookup function, better a lookup function. So I'm going to first assign the correct seasonal factor to the correct period. So let's say seasonal factor, that would be equal to, and I'm going to use VLOOKUP function. Not going to explain what's going on beyond telling you that VLOOKUP allows you to look up a value in a range and then return the value that you want. So what we're going to look up is the month. We're going to look up the month in this seasonal value table. And if I find it, it wants to know what column index to return. We've got two columns in the data, in the table. K is one column, L is the other column. We want to return column L, so that is the second column. We'll say the second one. Press enter. Does it work? I need to add a few it works. So the seasonal factor for October is 1.079. I've got 1.08, so I know the formula works. Now I can copy it down. The months is going to be relative as we go down, but the position for the table array is permanent. So I'm just going to press F4 and put the $ sign in front of it. Enter. There we have it. Now I can copy the formula all the way down and just check, right? This is January. The seasonal factor for January is 1.05, so that's correct. This is, what month is this? August. The seasonal factor is 0.929, which is equal to 0.93. So it's correctly selected. Now let's decisionalize the data by dividing the unit sales by the seasonal factor or relative that we calculated. I'm going to remove all of the zeros in here. And then I'm going to copy the formula all the way down. Go to the last one, check that the formula works just as correctly as it did the first time. Awesome, we are good. So now we've got the decisionalized data. And what we do after this point is just use one of the forecasting techniques to forecast the decisionalized data and then reseasonalize it. So what I'm going to do is use forecast decisionalized data. I'm going to wrap the text here so that I use less space. You know what I mean? I want the width to be smaller, so there we go. That's better. Unit sales, can we wrap that? Yes, we can. I want to make everything smaller so it fits on the same screen. Okay, so let's make this so that it's a word. And these, oh my goodness. Okay, I got carried away with the spelling. Decisionalized. Better? So, awesome. So now, yay, this is better. Now, I can use a forecast method. And I'm just going to do naive. I could have used any of the ones we looked at before, but I'm just going to do naive. So that's my forecast for the next period. Now I'm going to take that and add back seasonality. Again, to deseasonalize, you divide by the factor. To reseasonalize and get a seasonally adjusted forecast, you add back seasonal factor. So we'll call this, I'll just say forecast because it's easier when you label it this way. Reseasonalize. Reseasonalize. Okay, that just means I'm adding back seasonality. I can't do the first one because I don't have any forecast seeing the method that I used. So just be this multiplied by the seasonal factor and a little bit better. But understand that the method I used here is pretty crappy. Understand that. I used the naive method, and clearly not an adequate method. I probably would have been better off using the average, some kind of moving average. So let's try that. I'm going to delete this and go back and do maybe 5-period moving average, right? Equals MA5. Average, MA4 in this case, the last 4 periods. Okay, so let's use the average of the past 4 and check in. So now I'm going to reseasonalize that data and see if it makes more sense. Multiplied by the seasonal factor Press enter. This is what we come up with. Okay, so now let's see if we can eyeball it and compare it to what we expect, right? I'm going to hide this data so that I can show you the actual unit sales and our forecasted values side by side. Not too bad, not too bad, right? We don't know how good it is until we calculate MAD, MSE, MAPE, but it's not bad, it's not shabby. Unhide. And that is the end of this tutorial.